country. I'm on the West Coast, and my co-panelists and colleagues are pretty much out there in East America. But we want to welcome all of you. We're thrilled to be presenting this timely webinar brought to you by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. This panel is called Intra-Community Inequities, Perspectives from Featured Authors of Marginalized within Marginalized Communities. So this panel is comprised of authors who wrote compelling pieces for our most recent issue of the Human Rights magazine, which, just to remind you, is the award-winning flagship journal of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. CRSJ has been actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues in responsive to the current administration's executive orders, among other things. Please visit the website for updates on these programs. What we're trying to feature here is the intersection of vulnerabilities of our neighbors and various communities who are marginalized. Those communities of marginalized individuals are often presented as something very homogenous. But as we all know, working on the front lines of justice, that simply is not true. The intersectionality of different marginalizations can really undermine the ability for these individuals to actively secure rights. And fortunately, the heroes you see before you have dug in and are helping these communities to better serve themselves and all of us for a greater good. We're proud to uplift their work and continue the conversations beyond the pages of the magazine. Throughout today's discussion, we invite you to submit your questions. Use the Q&A, not the chat. If you don't see the Q&A controls, move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen. We'll monitor the Q&A box and do our best to raise as many questions as time allows. This program is recorded, and it is going to be shared with all the registrants soon after the event. So please feel free to share these materials with your networks. We want any and all of you to join the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section if you haven't already. It is the best bargain in town, $45, and you get this phenomenal magazine with authors literally across the globe writing on compelling issues, often from firsthand experience, and charging you with what you can do to solve these critical issues. Today, we have a phenomenal moderator, and I'm going to introduce Professor Turner Roberts, and she will then introduce each of the panelists. I am Francine Lippman. I am the chair of the editorial board of the Human Rights magazine, and we welcome your contributions to the magazine. So please do click on the link and see this phenomenal wealth of resources that you get if you're a member. Professor Keisha Turner Roberts not only is the moderator today, but she really arguably is the seed behind this issue in and of itself. She also served as the issue editor for this magazine. She also serves ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice as an editorial board member, and she's been active and engaged certainly since I joined the board. I'm now going to turn it over to Professor Turner Roberts, who is an assistant professor of law at Widener University in Delaware. And we welcome Keisha and her panelists. So thank you very much, each and all.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so thrilled and happy to be moderating this panel. We have lots of really go-getters, a lot of people who really believe in this issue. And so I'm going to get started with introducing the panelists. And as I introduce the panelists, if they could graciously please give us maybe 1 or 2 minutes of brief synopsis of the article, the name of the article, as well as the premise of the articles. First up is Professor Colleen P. Campbell. She is an associate of law at Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University. Professor Campbell writes, teaches, and speaks about issues of race and gender at the intersection of medicine, public health law, and regulatory law. At Hofstra, she teaches torts, administrative law, and a birth justice seminar. And her piece is called Colorism, Health Justice, and Black Women Health. Professor, can you tell us a little bit about your article?
Thanks a lot, both Professor Lippman and Professor Turner-Roberts and Ali for making this happen and inviting me to participate in the magazine issue and also this panel. I think it's important work and you all are doing a fantastic job. In terms of my article, my submission, it relates to some of the other work that I've done at the intersection of colorism and health law. And so colorism refers to the systematic preference for lighter skin. And where proximity to whiteness basically has a lot of significance in the lives of people of color. And so the idea that white is right, light is also right. And so on a systematic level, it means that skin color correlates with a lot of social and material benefits. And I think that, there's growing research in this area on colorism, less so in terms of colorism and health effects. And I just wanted to spend some time on that space, right? So there is now research that colorism also impacts health outcomes. And I thought about the framework of health justice and what it means to not just speak about laws that shape access to like healthcare resources, but also looking at some of the underlying systematic processes, the cultural processes that might contribute to adverse health outcomes. And I think the issue of skin lightening products, which I focus on to some extent, illustrate how not only is colorism driving certain practices like skin lightening, but it's also contributing to some of the health issues that are connected to these products. And so that's basically a summary of my project.
Great, thank you. And next we have Mr. Armin H. Marigin, who is a senior staff attorney at the Housing Works Incorporated, which is located in New York City, New York. Armin is one of the nation's leading civil rights and public interest attorneys. He practices impact litigation on issues involving AIDS, HIV, homelessness, public benefits, disability, gender, and housing discrimination. Armin's article was titled Marginalization and the Marginalized, Source of Income Discrimination and a Critical Need for Federal Protections. Armin. We can't hear you.
It would help if folks could hear me, and apologies. So what is source of income discrimination? Source of income discrimination is discrimination based on the use of public housing subsidies like vouchers and other housing allotments that various governments provide to folks. And the article focuses on the fact that our federal government has not added protections based on source of income to the other protected categories in the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968. And I think we'll talk a little bit more a little later. But this is one of the greatest issues facing low income and poor Americans. It is still lawful to discriminate in the majority of states in the United States based on source of income. It is a proxy, as we'll talk about, for other forms of discrimination. And there is a dire need, a critical need to add this protection nationally to the federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 in order to protect these folks. And so it's about the marginalized within marginalized communities, because voucher holders, as you can imagine, and as we'll discuss, are, again, intersectional among many, many different marginalized communities. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Last but not least is Ms. Stephanie Taylor. She is the project director of Incarcerated Mothers Law Project, and is a project of Volunteer of Legal Services, which is also located in New York. Ms. Taylor is an experienced legal services advocate with focusing on a diverse clientele. With regards to her piece, is entitled Separating Families, the Hidden Collateral Damage of Incarcerated Mothers. Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It is such an honor to be here with my esteemed panelists. And I wrote the article really on a little talked about collateral consequence of incarcerating parents, which is family separation and isolation. We've found few people are really focusing on this or talking about it. As you mentioned, I'm the director of our Incarcerated Mothers Law Project in Vols, and our work is going into prisons and meeting with individuals who are incarcerated in women's prisons and at Rosie's at Rikers Island, and just witnessing and trying to address the sheer need for assistance in reconnecting with their children and understanding their rights as far as they are as parents. And really the contact and relationship with their children is the most important thing that's going on in their lives. And yet there's no real way for them to address these needs because the system is just, there's nothing there to catch all of the fallout from incarcerating a parent. And of course, this impacts Black and brown parents the most, and is yet missing when our society talks a lot about mass incarceration. The focus does not seem to be, from our perspective at least, on incarcerating mothers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so now I'm going to open up this question. Being the editor, I gave a lot of thought to what exactly is marginalized within the marginalized communities, right? So we know that generally, there are marginalized communities, but we're talking about even a subset of those within those marginalized communities. And so my first question is, what does being marginalized within marginalized mean to you, professionally or personally? And how does it show up in your work? Professor Campbell, do you want to start off?
Sure. I think it's one obvious way is being a Black woman, both personally and professionally, gives me an outsider status that I think is key to how I approach my research. I definitely intentionally center Black women's experiences and women of color in my research. And so I use lenses like reproductive justice, birth justice, and these are intentional frameworks that have been developed primarily by women of color to address their erasure historically within other theoretical frameworks. So I'm walking in this tradition of analyses that women of color develop themselves to respond to their own erasure and domination. So one of the other ways that it impacts me in my research is that I spend a lot of time studying oppression along the lines of racism and gender, and in this particular project, skin color domination. But I also like to make sure that I'm looking for the ways that women are asserting their agency, like women of color are asserting their agency and are also finding ways to creatively respond to their own oppression. So I'm not just looking at them through this gaze of the academic as like victims of oppression, but they're also active actors and agents within structural domination as well. And so trying to have like a nuance and complex view towards oppression is something that I intentionally work on in my research.
Yeah, I think it's also critical that each of us we are more than the sum of us, right? Each of us have multiple identities, right? And as such, even if you are the dominant, you have the dominant role, you may also be marginalized in a particular way. For instance, if you are a trans man and you happen to be disabled, then you could have discrimination as transphobia, but also discrimination for services, for instance, because you're disabled. So I think that there are lenses within lenses that we need to take a look at in order to determine and look at the policies and the laws that have been passed. Armin, what do you think?
Sure. Well, at Housing Works, we serve, I mean, there are different layers of marginalization, right? And there are different, to use an overused term, intersectionalities. And at Housing Works, I'm proud to say, we serve the most underserved Americans. Our clients are overwhelmingly Black and brown, queer, trans, 70% present or former drug users, 50% criminal justice issues, immigrants and asylum seekers. And often what I've described is one client with all of those issues, right? So we understand intersectionality, but marginalization as well, and how it can affect folks in so many different ways, right? And so low income and poor folks have lots of fires going on. You know, you put out one fire and there's another one blazing. So that's one of the struggles that we have. And one of the things that we address is, you know, how do we get vocational training? How do we get healthcare? How do we get housing, which we say is healthcare? How do we take care of the many different things, the many different crises and traumas that are going on in client's life? And personally, all of it does, I am fueled by my own history and my own identity. I am the grandson raised with orphans of genocide. My two grandmothers sold into slavery. My maternal grandmother branded like a barnyard animal on her face, arms and chest as a slave. My maternal grandfather didn't even know his birthday. His parents were murdered when he was so young that he had to choose a day. He chose May Day, International Workers' Day. And so we always celebrated yesterday his birthday, which would have been well into the hundreds. So it means a lot to me personally, but more importantly, for my clients, it means a lot to examine marginalization and how it affects folks and how can we uplift them and put out the many different fires that they have blazing, sadly, in their lives.
Right. And Stephanie.
Yes, just when thinking about the incarcerated folks that we're meeting with, there's so much intersectionality. First, of course, race. We work with a tremendous amount of trans folks and immigrants, people with trauma, mental health issues, not to mention poverty. And just by virtue of the fact that all of these clients are incarcerated, it is incredibly difficult for them to access any of the systems, to really show up as the parents that they want to be, especially when dealing with the foster care systems. So it's just, when I think about it, there's so many layers and it's all compounding, all resulting in just sort of like extraordinary difficulty in navigating these systems due to the multiple layers of marginalization.
Yeah, so my first question actually goes back to you. I want to talk a little bit more about that a little bit. So why do you think the experiences of Black and brown women who are incarcerated, why do you think they're excluded so frequently within the broader context of family law or in criminal law?
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about like criminal justice reform, when we're talking about like family law reform efforts, it the focus has always seemed to be on those most privileged, maybe those with the loudest voices, and or the most visible, politically like palatable issues. So I feel like there's a lot of talk about like wrongful convictions and mass incarceration of men, I think are usually focused on. And then I think also in the family law reform efforts are focusing, there's like a lot of talk about parental rights in divorce cases. There's a lot of talk about child support enforcement and modification. So we're not talking about issues that are really more meaningful, I think, for Black and brown mothers, like maybe reforming the foster care system, maybe reforming um, uh, other, ways that they are impacted. So I think, and also the stigma of incarceration and poverty leads to moral judgments to their families. They're just considered less worthy of our attention or our advocacy. So that's what I'm thinking of for how, in particular, Black and brown women are really invisibilized in this system.
Right. Also, I think by being incarcerated, it takes away their agency with their children, right? They're not necessarily included in any of the custody decisions or the visitation decisions, or, it's very difficult, my understanding, it's very difficult when children are in foster care to retain custody, to maintain custody as you're incarcerated, or have a say to where the children go. So yeah, I think that also is ignored, right, in that arena.
Oh,
1,000%.
yes, it's impossible to for them to really engage with the foster care system. They have to be following up with a caseworker who maybe didn't bring their child to the prison for the visit, and rescheduling, and that doesn't happen. And then the end result is, oh, they're not paying attention, they're not engaged, they are abandoning their child, right? And then this all leads to like family separation. Absolutely.
Right. And so, Professor Campbell, I like your article because I resonate with that. I'm also a cisgendered African American woman, and I resonate with this. So can you elaborate a little bit on the mechanisms through which colorism contributes to these disparities in health? And then secondly, you also talked about this health justice framework. What is that, and how do you use that framework to address the disparities?
Sure. So health justice, basically, it emerged as a response to supplementing the traditional health law framework, which might focus more on, just access to like health insurance and typical things that we consider in health law that these don't really reach some of the deep systematic issues in society that impair access to health care for the most marginalized in the society. And so this framework is comprehensive in terms of looking at laws and policies that might reach some of these structural issues. And so in terms of colorism, it impacts health in a lot of the ways. There's a lot of research that's coming up now by people like Ellis Monk, who's a sociologist, and he is showing how, colorism impacts health in such a way that sometimes the in-group or intraracial disparities mirror or exceed the out-group disparities between Black and white. And so there is definitely this need for growing attention to how colorism impacts health. In terms of the pathways, I think that there's some ways that we already know how racism impacts health. Sometimes it's indirectly through socioeconomic status in terms of how race shapes access to some of the resources that are health promoting. So there's this material way in which racism might impact health indirectly through class. But also racism can be embodied as well. And so is colorism, right? So by that I mean, think of, or what does it mean to live every day within a context where dark skin is stigmatized? And the stigma is not just coming from the outgroup spaces, but intra-group spaces. And so what does it mean to internalize some of the stresses that come from that, right? And the way that it's a little bit different or different from racism is that it can happen in intimate spaces, intrafamilial spaces, and probably it's even more jarring for that because, many of us, we come from mixed color families. And so I think that that's one of the things that these sociologists are doing a good work in terms of uncovering some of the pathways of how colorism might affect us. right? I am obviously on the privileged side of the status quo. And so I think that there's a lot of reflection that I do in terms of what that means and identifying it in my life and how I see it manifest. And we can talk about that later if it comes up. But the last way that it manifests is relating to some of the work on like skin lightening that I'm talking about. And I would frame that as like market-based, maybe media-based as well. And so to the extent that companies are profiting from products that are high risk and toxic, and these products are reinforcing the dominant hierarchy of colorism, there is this market-based incentive to produce these products and to create a demand for them. And these themselves are actually health risks. And so there are lots of different ways that they emerge. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay. And Stephanie, do you see a lot of synergy with regards to what Professor Campbell was saying with regards to these disparities, not necessarily colorism disparities, but maybe, well, it could be colorism disparities with regards to how the treatment of African, brown, and Black and brown mothers who are incarcerated, and how that is sort of, the outcomes there with regards to even more so with women who are incarcerated with regards to their recidivism and, them like flourishing versus not. So I see a lot of synergy between the two articles that you guys have written there that we're going to touch. Hopefully want to make a comment to that.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. There's so much synergism when we look at different outcomes for our like white clients versus clients of color. Very different experiences with all of the systems, very different outcomes, and then they just snowball into something much bigger. And this happens, in almost every case.
Okay. Now turning to Ahmed. So for those, I think there are those who may not know what source of income discrimination is. I think you kind of defined it. Can you talk a little bit more how these intersects with other types of marginalized groups, such as disabled and veterans and things like that, to the extent you're able?
Sure. So just by way of background, we got a Civil Rights Act in this country in 64, voting rights in 65, and we finally, after 400 years, this government finally passed a law to protect discrimination in housing. And that was in 1968, the Fair Housing Act. The problem, and there's always problems, right, for our communities. The problem, the ugly coincidence is that the law was passed right around the time that the United States started changing from a project-based model of housing people to a voucher-based model of housing people. The idea was, why are we warehousing overwhelmingly poor Black and brown folks in these giant projects, hopeless, no diversity of any kind, economic or otherwise, often on the site of former toxic waste dumps and across tracks and far from family networks, far from employment, far from transportation and so forth. Let's give folks a voucher, and that's a way of avoiding the warehousing and desegregating folks and giving them a chance to mainstream. And both sides of the aisle, as I say in my article, agree that it's a wildly successful program. The problem is folks have to accept those vouchers in order for it to work. And when they passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, they did not include lawful source of income, vouchers and subsidies, as a protected category. And so it becomes a proxy, a subterfuge for other forms of discrimination. Why? Because who overwhelmingly has vouchers and subsidies in this country? Black and brown folks, disabled folks, female-headed households, queer folks, disabled living with HIV, and disabled households in general. So, I mean, the figures are startling. It's upwards of almost 90% of Section 8 households are female-headed. A huge percentage have at least one disabled member in the family. In some municipalities, the number of people with vouchers or subsidies who are Black or brown is well over 90% in many of these areas. And so saying, we take Black people, we take the disabled, we take queer folks, but, we don't like the Section 8 program or system, notwithstanding that they pay full market rent and prop up the entire market as a result, is a way of saying we don't take your kind. And so My article focuses on the fact that if we don't have a federal protection with slightly more than half of the states in the United States not enacting source of income protections, then this is a perfectly valid legally, if of course invalid morally, response and defense. And so our folks are turned away, and not for the first time in their lives, now based on the fact that they have a voucher, and notwithstanding the fact that that voucher pays full market rent, and so therefore gives the landlord a direct vendor check for most, if not all, of that rent every month. So there can be no other really valid reason. And the economic and other reasons that are proffered by landlords have been debunked, as I say it in the article, because in fact it's a zero-sum game for landlords to have millions of folks having their rent paid and the market therefore propped up by government dollars. So that's what we're focusing on. And so to your point, yes, it is absolutely there is absolutely a commonality with other marginalized folks, because our folks are often many different categories of marginal all in one.
So let me pause for a second. Do we have any questions? No, we don't. All right. So let's go back to Colleen. So why do you think colorism remains a blind spot in health law or in the justice system, advocacy system as a whole? And what can we do to change that, do you think?
I think there are lots of reasons why colorism is overlooked. So people like Trina Jones, Professor Trina Jones, she's done an amazing work in her article, Shades of Brown, to talk about the anti-discrimination context. And so Title VII, it bans race and color-based discrimination, and yet these claims are basically being glossed over or ignored by courts. And part of the reason is, I would say I'm going to be bold to say it's a paucity of imagination, or this idea that I think courts are having a hard time grappling the fact that if a white person hires me, for example, they might not also be willing to discriminate against a darker skinned person. So the idea that you can be, hiring light skinned folks, but still discriminate against Black folks is hard for courts to reckon with. Or the fact that a Black person would discriminate against another Black person. And so I think that there is this reluctance in that context to actually embrace and give attention to these claims. And in terms of, I feel that in terms of the broader racial justice movement, I get the sense of we need to prioritize the violence that's coming against the Black society, the interracial violence. And so police violence, is something that is constructed as this racial justice issue. But when we actually look at, who's being subjected disproportionately to police violence, a lot of the times it's predominantly darker skinned Black men. And so what does it mean to be able to have a conversation about the colorism issue that's underlying this? And these are, the men are probably more from, working class backgrounds or whatever. So there's a class layer as well. And so we can have a conversation about racial domination, but also additionally talking about colorism and classism. And these are actually health issues, public health issues. Right. So, police violence is contributing to premature Black death, right? Mortality and morbidity of the Black community. So we can actually have a framing that talks about the actual toll of what's happening without necessarily sacrificing the larger quest for racial justice. I also think that, because of the interracial dynamics, it almost could seem, and you can tell me if you think this is correct, that it might be airing our dirty laundry, so to speak, right? But I think that's problematic because of a lot of the trauma that's been it's real, right? The brown paper bag tests, these blue vein societies that existed so that people like me could enter aristocratic Black spaces, they're real and the trauma continues. And so we need to be able to have multiple conversations interracially and interracially.
Yeah, I 1,000% agree. Yes, even when I was growing up, with regards to the colors, say if my boyfriend was a certain color, they're discouraging me to marry a person who's darker than I happen to appear, right? So I think you're right. It's not only external, but also how we think of ourselves. And a lot of that's conditioned based on history and, quite frankly, the laws that were in place. In many southern states during the Jim Crow era, they really define who's Black and who is not Black, right?
Right.
And so that a lot of that, and that still remains with us, I think.
So yeah, and so the whole point is, right, we don't want to lose sight of the colorism, but also situating it as serving the interests of racial domination and white supremacy, right? It benefits the racial hierarchy to have these fragmentations within communities, to have even fragmentation among the working class, right? It benefits a particular racial and class hierarchy to have these gradations within communities. And so it's important not to lose sight of what the purpose is, while also giving it adequate treatment.
Yeah, totally agree. Armand, what legal strategies have been effective in combating source of income discrimination, and how can they be applied more broadly? I mean, other than like legislation.
Sure. I mean, the sad thing is what's been most successful is bringing litigation. First of all, the vast majority of people who suffer source of income discrimination don't even know that they were discriminated against, right? You're talking about folks who have suffered discrimination over and over again in their lives. And often they've come to us and literally 100 or 200 landlords and real estate agents have told them by that point that they don't accept vouchers. And they hadn't come to us because they didn't know it was illegal. And that's particularly the case in jurisdictions that passed new source of income laws overnight with no federal protection. What was perfectly lawful for 400 years plus is now suddenly unlawful. That combined with the fact that, right, born low-income folks can't afford legal representation. There's only a limited number of experts in housing discrimination nationwide and in any particular city. And there's also a dearth of fair housing testing. We all know that any discriminator who has half a brain is going to enlist different, and we may get to this later, but different approaches to try to evade liability for what they do. And the only way to catch them often is through fair housing testing, right? And paired testing where you combine a non-voucher holder with a voucher holder. So the sad part is what's been most effective is to punch them right in the face and bring them into court and litigate against them, particularly because fee shifting statutes, which are always attached to housing discrimination provisions, often are the sword of Damocles over their head. Sadly, American jurisprudence still wildly undervalues emotional distress damages for civil rights litigants. They don't understand, and it's overwhelmingly because who's on our judiciary and how much have they suffered and understood the trauma of emotional distress. They don't understand what it means to go through the emotional distress of a civil rights violation, a violation that is very rarely, if ever, the first time someone has been othered and excluded and mistreated because of their race and their gender and their disability and their sexual orientation and other things. These are folks for whom it's another straw on the camel's back. And the courts are very poor in compensating that. But attorney's fees can be huge. In the first ever source of income trial, I'll just leave you with this, in New York that we brought, our attorney's fees were over $500,000. So what is successful in getting the market, the real estate market, to understand you can't exclude our folks? A $500,000 attorney's fee bills. Don't do this again to our folks, because they're folks that landlords and real estate agents think no one's watching, no one's helping. And when you say, no, we're watching and we have their back, it really has a ripple effect. So my answer is bringing litigation and bringing fair housing testing to catch folks at what they're doing is the most important way of fighting this.
Right. So what argues do you think on the other side with regards to a landlord should have the right to rent to whoever he or she chooses to? What do you say to that?
Right, that old canard. From the beginning of time, there has been a right-wing and I believe very bigoted defense to any anti-discrimination law, which is your anti-discrimination law encroaches upon my freedoms. And this is what we get from the right all the time, the idea of freedom, which is never defined broadly, but very, very sparingly for the haves versus the have-nots. I think it's absolute bullcrap. Your right to make individual choices must fall in light of the ramifications of doing so on ways that are based in bigotry and discrimination. There is no unfettered right to do everything and anything you want to do, and your right to do so fails when you're excluding people based on ableism, based on racism, based on so many other forms of discrimination. So thankfully, the courts have never fully credited the notion that individual choice trumps anti-discrimination laws. If it did, we'd be really in trouble. We brought a major discrimination case in a transgender rights case here in New York against the Transit Authority. 40,000 workers in New York work in the transit system, and they had no protections based on gender identity, and particularly for trans folks. And there was a horrible trans bashing case in which, among other things, the government, the Transit Authority, said, wait a minute, this is a violation of our First Amendment rights, right? Which is the other canard that we hear all the time. I have a right to say and do these things that are protected by the First Amendment. And thankfully, a nice published decision said, no, you don't. You have no First Amendment right to trans bash people. And so we're running into this all the time with folks doing it. And it's often by the government. The late constitutional scholar Charles Black, professor at Columbia and at Yale Law School, who co-authored the Brown versus Board of Education brief, pointed out very poignantly that throughout history, the greatest human and civil rights violations have been committed by governments. And you think of Korematsu, and you think of Brown versus Board of Education, and you think of Loving versus Virginia, and you start contemplating that because you think of corporations and private people. But in fact, governments are often behind this. And here was the government saying there should be a First Amendment right by government employees to trans bash someone. So yeah, we see that all the time. But thankfully, your rights to free speech and to individuality are trumped by the right for our citizens to have equal and fair opportunities.
Speaking of that, because I know we as the United States, we don't have a right to housing. Not like the EU, there is like a constitutional right to housing. How does that fit in your argument as to source of income discrimination? How would that fit or not fit?
Well, I mean, it would be great if there were a governmental duty to provide housing. We would also get the government far more involved in housing. I mean, a government is much more likely, I would hope, to accept their own vouchers and subsidies if they're running the programs. But we hear the cries of communism and race and socialism if that's done, which is preposterous because we know the government has often been a source to get around bigotry. You know, in the early days of this country, when we finally had anti-discrimination laws, we still had the government providing jobs to Black and brown people where corporate America and white Americans weren't ready to take them in. The same thing with women. So when you look at the careers of early civil rights giants, and you see so many of them having worked in the post office or having worked for the government and so forth, and women weren't even hired for law firms. They could not get a law firm job, but they could go work for the Department of Justice or for other governmental entities. So the government actually running programs would be a huge way of getting around this because the subsidy would be applied by the very people who are paying it. So I think that would be huge. Thankfully, in New York, we actually do have a right to housing for unhoused individuals. And so we've done a lot of litigation around that because you actually have a right to housing if you're unhoused in New York, which is huge as a result of the New York State Constitution, and would that other people would do that. The problem is that that is emergency housing, transitional or congregate housing, and it's no place for any individual to live. The key is to transition them from that into their own dignified private housing, which is the wellspring of wealth building and management, of education, of healthcare, because housing is healthcare, particularly for the HIV/AIDS community, as we always say. So it would be enormous if we could have a governmental right to housing and have the government more involved, if for no other reason than the fact that the government is less likely to turn away their own folks from their own vouchers and their own subsidies.
Thank you. Let's see, Stephanie. I want to ask you a question about like what policy reforms. I think you mentioned one with regards to family law increase access for incarcerated women. That's one reform. Can you talk about any other reforms in addition to that that will mitigate the negative impacts on families as a result of maternal incarceration?
Absolutely. I've been in touch with another attorney in Washington State, and I've learned a lot about an incarcerated parent. So I think it's called the Children of Incarcerated Parents Bill, that mandates that incarcerating parents in that process, their access to their children has to be something that CPS is focused on and contact is facilitated. So I think that would be an excellent starting point for any other state. And of course, by the way, any reform should be informed by directly impacted communities, not to be a, top-down attorney. There's also of course, Adoption and Safe Families Act. And if folks don't know what that is, this was signed into law in 1996 by Bill Clinton. The idea was to keep children out of foster care because children were just going from foster care home to foster care home and not having any stability. And so the idea was to prevent that from happening and to find stability for children. And of course, this has led to many, I think the unintended consequence is that so many parents have lost their parental rights. And so something that many states are focusing on is like amending or reforming that. In New York State, we have I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it allows judges to not allow the termination of parental rights when incarceration is the only reason that a parent hasn't been planning for the return of their child. And that has been great. Of course, there's still so many hurdles for our clients to have to jump through. But that is at least a step in the right direction, because without that, just for folks to know, if a child is in foster care for 15 out of 22 months, then CPS or ACS must file a termination of parental rights. And so if somebody's sentence is over 15 of 22 months, they would necessarily lose their parental rights for their children. There's so many other possibilities just for potential reform, which is like family-based sentencing alternatives. I had this recent idea of having just like parent advocates working out of prisons and jails. Just the amount of people we speak with who don't know if they have a case coming up, don't know who their attorney is, haven't heard from their attorney. We spend a lot of time just contacting attorneys who are apparently assigned, but haven't spent any time with their client. That's very horrible to hear about. Also, I don't know if anyone has worked in an LSC-funded organization, but LSC restricts any grantees from using not just LSC funding, but all of an organization's funding on anyone who is incarcerated. And now, by the way, I want to just make sure people understand that it's only for representation of incarcerated.
What is LIC? What is it?
Sorry, Legal Services Corporation. Yes. Sorry.
Okay.
Coming from an LLC funded organization, I forget. So
I did too. I used to work for one as well. I totally get it.
Yes, many restrictions when you're in an LSC funded organization. And by the way, many states really only have LSC funded organizations, which means that most legal services organizations across the country are not allowed to work with anybody, or they think they can't work with anybody who's incarcerated. It's the case that they can't go into court and make an appearance. They can do other things, but of course they shy away from that. So that's something that I think should absolutely be amended. And then just really like a focus on like reentry is another area where a lot of focus on reentry. And when I am speaking, I've been in touch with so many amazing like grassroots organizations and other legal organizations on reentry, and it feels like focusing on family it's not really like a main focus. And yet, when we're speaking with our clients, it's like their top priority. So there's so many things that can be done. And some of the things are happening, but I'd say that for the most part, no really elected officials are going to bat for incarcerated parents for the most part.
Right. I like the ideas of that you came up with, also with the parent advocate idea. I'm curious about, because I know when I practiced in DC, we had like really concrete best practices, standards that we had to meet or had to think about. One thing that I think could be interesting is to develop those best practices standards, right? And maybe, and perhaps have the ABA or
Yes,
some other organization say, hey, maybe we should implement these, maybe we should develop these standards, right?
right.
Are there any concerns? Are there any concerns about the new administration reducing the ability to collect data that helps support your positions,
To
like
collect.
with regards to like collecting data, like for instance, especially for incarcerated people,
Mhm.
and specifically for incarcerated people of color, there is a push, I believe, to not necessarily prioritize collection of that type of data. Do you think that will have an impact on maybe bolstering your arguments that you would make, for instance?
I think, yeah, it could, especially if that's leading to longer sentences, or
Right,
inability to get out on parole. Um,
right.
because that just means longer term separation for a parent and their child. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And also we do know that there's impacts from incarceration of parents. It's still not only the parents are impacted, but also the children are impacted, which have ripple effects in anything else they do in their lives with regards to school, mental health, and the like, and even their own physical health.
Absolutely.
So let's see. How are we on time, guys? I think we're cool. We're jamming. All right. Armit, I know we've talked offline about the homeless, right? There's no necessarily right for housing in most jurisdictions and municipalities. There's no right to housing for the homeless. I know in DC we recognize as the homeless as a protected class, which prevents them from being discriminated against. But that's just for DC. I know that we also talked about, you know, public policies and rulings that are targeting encampments in public usage of spaces. Specifically the Grants Pass versus Johnson case. How do you see this trend affecting people who are already marginalized by the source of income discrimination?
Sure, we saw it right here in New York. A lot of people may not know that Mayor Giuliani actually at one point declared the state of being homeless to be illegal. You're so poor that you're illegal. That's basically
Wow.
what he did. A lot of people don't know that about America's mayor, who was at the time the most powerful mayor in America, not the person you see now with hair gel going down his face and so forth. But in any event, at that very time that he declared illegal, we had a contempt motion against him because he was failing to provide housing for unhoused people who are living with HIV and AIDS. So the irony of failing to provide housing, which the law dictates, and at the same time criminalizing being homeless and on the street was seen right here in New York. I mean, look, the two go together. Our system, we have such a horrible dearth of housing for low income and poor folks in this country. We do not invest in it. We don't support it. It should be supportive housing, by the way, for folks with drug use, with folks with mental health issues and so forth. It's actually far cheaper to house people in a supportive environment in which you help them to get their lives together and deal with the issues that they have than it is to pay for emergency housing and emergency room visits, which is what happens when folks are on the street with frostbite, with other communicable diseases and so forth. So it's penny wise and pound foolish as well. We see it all the time. But the criminalization, as the Grants Pass case upholds, of homeless people is just another nail in the coffin of the rights of poor folks and unhoused folks, because here we are hoping that we can get them into some sort of congregate transitional housing and then get them a voucher to get out of it. I mean, now you can't even sleep on the street. Where do you go? And then how do you recover in order to then undergo a housing search to use your voucher to then find a place that will house you? And meanwhile, you're running from the police and trying to get 40 winks when they're after you. If you have so much as a pillow, or
Right,
apparently if you
right.
ball up a jacket under your head
That's
and you
sufficient.
lean on it, you're illegal. And
Right.
so it's just that it is the culmination of neoliberal policies that would declare and render marginalized people themselves illegal, because you can't disassociate the person from the homelessness. And so that state is
Right.
where they are as a human being, and you're telling them that they're not legal. So you want to talk about marginalizing people, you are criminalizing their status as human beings, and it's horrifying.
Yes. We can't hear you, Princeton. Professor Lippman.
I'd love to give you a little break so that you can wet your whistle, and I'll ask a question from the Q&A. So, Armin has suggested that we're erasing people and making them illegal. As we all know, undocumented immigrants have literally been erased in some capacities, with their taxpayer IDs erased, eliminated, and these individuals disappeared from the streets and sent out of the country. How does the intersection of immigration status impact your work? I've worked on the front lines, Professor Campbell, and it's so interesting to me when people think of someone who's an undocumented immigrant, their mind's image always goes to someone who is dark-skinned. I'd love to hear your thoughts about colorism and immigration status.
So, do both Armin and I take that question, or?
Yes, and Miss Taylor as well, Stephanie.
So, I'm trying to think of the connections between colorism and
Well, we'll give you a minute to contemplate. Stephanie or Amir, you want to jump in?
Sure, it relates directly to my work. I can tell you that one of the first things that President Trump did when he came into office was to issue an order immediately ending birthright citizenship, or purporting to end birthright citizenship. So I joined with a group of intrepid lawyers in Boston, lawyers for justice, lawyers for civil rights, to seek an injunction against that. And I was enlisted as a housing expert to provide testimony as to how doing so would affect undocumented families and children. And of course, it has a direct effect, because if you are not granted birthright citizenship, you are ineligible for vouchers and subsidies. You are ineligible for housing assistance programs. You are ineligible for welfare programs. You can't even get FEMA money. So if you're undocumented and you're a family and you have citizens, right, US born citizens, and you're undocumented as children, and you suffer a tragedy, a horrible, a flood, whatever, you also can't get any money from FEMA. So in every way, it further marginalizes undocumented people if their children are not given birthright citizenship, because it renders them ineligible for everything. And then it becomes a cycle. And it's so sad, because we see over and over again every stereotype about undocumented people being torn down. The studies show them to be among the hardest workers in America. A new study that just came out this week said that undocumented people pay more into the Social Security system than they get out of it. So it's a zero-sum game for everyone financially, sadly, on the backs of hardworking undocumented people. So it absolutely affects what we do. And so the assault on undocumented people affects them in every way. And in my world, it directly affects their ability to secure housing, to put their life together, to pursue asylum claims that they might have pending, while they work, and try to put themselves and their families in order. So yes, it has a direct effect on everything that we do.
And it absolutely has an impact on our work as well. Just right off the bat, I would say that language access is something that we are constantly struggling with, and getting interpreters for clients in court. At the prisons, there are no interpreters, which means that when we go in to meet with the individuals at the prisons and the jails, we would have to bring an interpreter so that we can just speak with somebody. There's no one there to offer that service. And then, of course, for someone who has an ICE detainer on them, the ability for them to, reconnect with their children once they're out is impossible if they are detained and deported. As you probably know, immigrant advocates across the country are working now. I mean, of course, everybody is probably on standby guardianship forms and just really trying to help people prepare for the possibility that they will be deported and their children may stay here and who's going to take care of their children. So that's, of course, compounding all the other issues and just having a connection with their children.
So I probably should have put a disclaimer at the beginning that all views I express here are mine, not my institutions. So in terms of colorism, the way that I think about colorism, I've spoken about it in the context of the Black community, but it's in every community of color, right? And it's this mode of stigmatizing dark skin. And it serves the interest of racial domination. And if we think about what's going on here, I would like to see the white undocumented person who's been, right, depicted in the same way, or I don't see it, right? So we know that this is really about this reassertion of white supremacy and using the immigration system to dehumanize, stigmatize. These were the pretext we've seen for the past several years, this depiction of immigrants as inherently criminally prone, which is the complete opposite because rates of crime are lowest among immigrants and they're higher among native-born Americans. And yet we have this complete flip in the paradigm to criminalize immigrants. And so, right, in terms of colorism, it is a mode of stigmatization and dehumanization as well. And that's what's happening to immigrants by labeling them in a particular way. So you can justify treating them as subhuman. You can justify discarding them without due process, right? And not even think twice about a, gay makeup artist who is like now potentially forever, in some black hole somewhere. And so, yeah, it's all related. It's the immigrant community is very diverse, right? There are a lot of complexities in the immigrant community. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you each and all, and thank you, Professor Roberts.
Are there questions from the audience? Or are we like?
No, I think
this is
Professor Roberts, if you have some more questions, we have about 20 minutes left, but I just thought I'd intersect and ask that question since it was.
okay. Thank you.
Yep.
You need to be unmuted. Now I need to be unmuted. All right, so I think that there is a question that has been answered. So, all right, so let's see. Excuse me, I feel like I'm not organized. So what role do professional organizations like the ABA play in either perpetuating or dismantling these intra groups of marginalization? So what role do you think? And I can go to anyone. I think even with the issue that we did, we're putting a spotlight on something that people actually don't think about, right? In that we are more like than we think we are. We have intersectionality on top of intersectionality. And so I think, with regards to our section, I think with our Human Rights Magazine, that's one way of spotlighting these group, and it actually it requires you to think broadly, right? A little bit more. I mean, to be honest with you, I never really thought about marginalized within marginalized until recently, right? And I think the more we understand that they exist, I think the more we can have more inclusive policies that will address some of the problems that we all go through, in addition to those people who are marginalized. So what ways do you think our policies may play in perpetuating this marginalization, do you think? If you have any thoughts on that.
How about, so the magazine itself is the Human Rights Magazine.
Mhm.
And what I've heard so many of you talk about when you talk about the various issues your clients and colleagues and neighbors face, you talk about housing as a human right. You talk about healthcare as a human right. What about access to your children, being a parent, parenting as a human right? Let's talk about human rights and how critical it is that not only the ABA civil rights and social justice is on the front line now, but things like, tragically, Armin, Section 8 housing is going to be cut significantly in the budget that is being proposed right now. As Professor Roberts has indicated, data collection on communities of color, mothers, incarceration rates, et cetera, in order to make these claims of discrimination. And healthcare. We've talked about, tragically, the very high mortality rates for Black mothers. And how can we, gather that data in order to make change? We know that healthcare organizations are being gutted in their research. So let's talk about this current moment in time and the intersection with human rights. Armin?
Yeah, I mean, in this country, it's very weird. We draw a distinction sometimes between civil rights and human rights, and I've never quite understood that. Human rights are something that happens abroad. It's as if, American exceptionalism. We're not responsible for that. Of course, at the same time, civil rights are always used through the prism of black and white movies, right? It's ML King and it's children being, watered down by fire hoses and so forth. It's just also hypocritical and wrong. So, I think everything that we're talking about here is human rights. These are the basic rights of dignity, right? The dignity of the incarcerated mother, the dignity of the children to be parented by that mother and to have access to and to be raised by the mom, notwithstanding the difficult circumstances. But we have an administration now that is undertaking an assault on everything that we have done to try to reverse some of the imbalances, because we have always had from the right an acircumstantial approach to the world. The world just happens to be as it is today because the world started this morning. There's no history. There are no, circumstances that explain where people are. Wherever they are, they deserve to be. We don't want to hear why they're there and what might structurally and otherwise not only contribute to that, but need to be addressed in order to make things fair and equitable and inclusive, right? So this assault on equity and inclusion and diversity is a way of saying that, first of all, we don't want to be reminded of all that we have done to exclude and undiversify and so forth, right? But also that by doing so, by cutting these programs, we can allow the white power structure and wealth, equal or even greater importance, to continue unchecked, right? So it influences everything that we do to undo these programs. It is a neoliberal playbook that has been that was really launched many years ago. Mercer Baradaran, who's a brilliant professor at Cal Irvine, has written a great book. It's called The Quiet Coup, that lays all of this out. What we're seeing now is the culmination of stuff that's been undertaken for so long by right-wing think tanks and
Plus
right-wing
30 years.
right?
Plus 30 years, yeah.
For decades.
Yeah.
And it even started before that. You know, the Reagan administration implemented so many of these programs, but programs that started even earlier to basically say government bad, except where government is helping rich folks and corporations, which they do every day. The entire structure of American capitalism is propped up by, secured by big government. But big government to help folks who have been traditionally excluded is bad. And so that's what we're seeing. It's a culmination, but an ugly, ugly extension of a neoliberal philosophy that rejects any efforts to undo all of the harms, both historical and present, as if they just don't exist.
At the same time, and really well said, Armin, at the same time, we see this quest to make America healthy again and redefining health in basically eugenic terms, right? And so there's now going to be push to gather data on autistic people and to start, doing all manner of things I can't imagine with this data. And so I think it's very interesting, this paradox of we're going in a particular direction of, right, we're trying to make the country healthy again. And it's looking, almost like 1920s public health in America. And so, I just find it really fascinating and interesting from a health perspective.
Stephanie.
I'll chime in to say, I agree with you, Dr. Roberts. The ABA shining a light on these areas has been, I think, fantastic. I think, at least from the article that I wrote, it is something that most people don't know anything about. Everyone, including pretty well educated people that we've, worked with and trained, seem to think that people who are parents who are going into the system would necessarily have some sort of safety net or would have a plan for their children and that plan would look like who has custody and what is the visitation going to look like. In fact, there is nothing like that. So I appreciate the fact that we could have our articles published. This is really wonderful. I would also say that I have leaned on several formal opinions by the ABA in pushing forth, like I was mentioning, language access is something that we have a lot of focus on. And I didn't realize that they had published a few opinions on language access and how not only nonprofits, but all lawyers need to be ensuring that their communication with all of their clients, regardless of any language difference, is focused on and addressed. Otherwise, that could be a violation of 1.1. So that was, amazing. Also, there's wonderful, ethics opinions on working with incarcerated folks. So I think it, from my perspective, it has done wonderful work. And I know other organizations also have taken a lot of time and care in highlighting marginalized groups. But I think, all groups could probably do more, especially right now, as we are seeing our profession as a focus of this administration. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. And I guess I have a question. Looking ahead, what gives you hope? I know things seem to be dark, very dark at times, but what gives you hope about the direction we'll be going, your work that we're doing through the magazine, to your individual scholarship, Professor Campbell, to your work at your visual, your clients rather, how do you see, is there anything to be hopeful for, I guess I should say?
And let's also think about the next generation of lawyers
Yes.
out there, right? Let's give them some light.
Armin, what are you thinking? Oh, I'm sorry. You want to go, Professor Campbell?
Sure.
Uh,
I think so before we started talking about the national policies, I was like more hopeful, but I'm gonna try to
mhm.
go back and thinking what I was thinking. I am hopeful when I see organizations who are working on issues of like obstetric violence and maternal health issues, like the Birthrights Bar Association. They've changed their name recently to Birth Justice Bar Association, and so there's this intentional work that's being carried out to make sure that the movements, the legal movements, and organizations are actually meeting those who are most marginalized around us. And I just want to shout out like Indra Lucero and Elephant Circle. They have also been actually pushing forward this framework of obstetric racism. And so we've traditionally thought of obstetric violence as this very uniquely gendered issue of gender-based violence. But, thanks to Black women academics, we're now incorporating obstetric racism in our research, in our advocacy efforts, and they've been supporting women filing claims with the Office of Civil Rights when it actually existed. And so they've been supporting documenting how it is that racial violence in obstetrics is happening. And I am hopeful that, these efforts are going to continue, regardless of what happens, in terms of larger politics. And so, yeah, I think that there's still a lot of energy to support marginalized groups, and even showing up to spaces like these, it's giving me energy right now.
Armin?
Sure, I'll be honest. I'm not optimistic at all. But what I say is whether I'm optimistic is irrelevant. What I am is resolved. Dante said that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in time of moral crisis, seek to maintain their neutrality. So we are in a moral crisis right now. I'm not going to be neutral. I am not optimistic, but that pessimism is not going to lead me to do nothing. It's going to spur me on to do more, because we all have the privilege of even passing judgment on whether we can be optimistic or pessimistic, largely on behalf of other folks. What we need to do is fight for other folks. Do I see things as horrible and getting worse in many ways? Yes, that's a pessimism. But I also feel for that very reason that I just have to fight more and more. I'd like to think that in this moral crisis, that when I look back in my life, that I did something, because just decrying it and being pessimistic gets us absolutely nowhere, especially for the folks who have no one. So yes, I'm pessimistic, but I'm also resolved. So I think the two go hand in hand. I can't lie and say that I'm optimistic. And for any young people who are out there, Francine, do something. If you're pessimistic, then when you go to sleep at night and you rail against all that's wrong, you'll feel a little bit better if you at least try to tilt against it. And you'll feel better both as a human being and for everyone else. And we might just change the world a bit. For example, we got an injunction against Trump's suspension of birthright citizenship. So there are victories to be had as well. And we have to tilt at those, because if we don't, no one else will, and things will get even worse. So when things are dreadful, fight back. That's all I have to say.
And Stephanie?
I mean, hope. Yes, I have hope. I have hope in all of the grassroots organizations that are have sprung up by people who are formerly incarcerated around the country. They're doing incredible work, and they're making things happen. One example is the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women, Girls, Women, and Girls. Their motto is nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us, which is I think those are words to live by. There are really amazing other social services organizations that are operating like within prisons that I haven't actually mentioned, but they are integral to our work, Our Children and Osborne Association. And so they are like our strong partner, and I feel like with them, and I also didn't mention I train a good amount of pro bono attorneys from the big law firms in New York City, and the passion and focus and zeal that I see in these attorneys is so inspiring, and it really lifts me up. They have been, we are going to maximum security prisons, and some of the cases they're difficult, and that their commitment never wavers. So that also gives me great hope. There's also, as I mentioned, legislation that is being considered in many states, including New York. So all of these things I think are hopeful. There's also, I feel like there's just like book after book, documentaries coming out focusing on this population. So to me, there's at least more attention, and that gives me hope.
How about you guys? I mean, Professor Turner Roberts and Francine.
I think that what gives me hope somewhat is my students, right? I help them to mold, to shape, and to understand what the law is and what it can do. And that law is privilege. To practice it is a privilege and an honor, right? And that we have to uphold the rule of law for everyone, or it won't apply, or it won't work for anyone, right? And so I really focus on them as hope for the future, to teach them how to think critically, to fight hard and be honest and thorough in their representation of individuals. I think that it's also hope that we can't forget. We are not allowed to forget our past. We're not. And that it is our job to remind people of who we are and who we might still be later, but also strive to be better, right? And I think other countries have done a better job of recognizing the past things they've done and to not repeat them. We have a nasty habit as Americans. We don't do that very well, right?
So can you, I'm curious, speak more about that, because
okay,
I think I know what you're doing.
right. I'm thinking that if you, like, for instance, for transgender individuals, we've known since millennia that they have existed. Just because you pass a executive order does not negate their existence, right? And you can't and you should not sweep people under the rug to act as though they don't exist, because they do, right? You wouldn't want the majority of individuals, we have to share this world with all people, regardless of what they look like. And I think a lot of it's based on fear and fear of self, fear of losing power, whatever that means, and actually have to share the fruits and share things that people are really hesitant to do, right? And so I think the past 20 years, we've been doing a lot of that, getting more diverse opinions, right? And not just the monolithic way of thinking about things. And so now we're seeing a backlash of that. But I think it's important for us historians, or us lawyers, to remember this is our history. This is what our law said, right? We should not be allowed to retrench and go back, right? And it's our job to be stewards of the law and stewards of history, to be honest with you, to protect the history, even when it's being misread, reread, or just outright erased. So that's what I'm thinking.
This has been a powerful hour and a half. And I know when I look at your faces and I feel the energy from each and all of you, I am empowered. And Armin is right. As lawyers, we are privileged and empowered. And we need to use that power and that privilege to push back against oppression. And I'm going to give each of you one last word. It's Friday afternoon. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart, Professor Roberts and Professor Campbell, Stephanie Taylor, Armin Merjan. You are incredible passion warriors for justice. And your articles, which I pushed you hard to finish, are phenomenal, because I knew, having read your bios, you are the change I want to see in this world. So last word, and then we'll have to break for the weekend. But the work continues.
Professor Campbell.
Yeah, I think that in this moment, I'm a Black woman from the developing world, global South, if you will. And so I have as much, hope and optimism from that perspective. And so it's a bit sobered along the lines of what Armin was saying. And so, I'm going to show up every day in my authenticity as a Black woman, Black immigrant woman, and do the work that I need to do and to assert myself and the interests that are advanced in my community. And so I just want to thank you all for creating the space to continue that work. And I'm invigorated by this conversation.
Armin.
Yeah, I mean, look, you just look around the panel and you see that people are doing something and you can take inspiration from that. You're not alone. It's very easy to feel alone when you see so many people in this country and so many policies that are so insane that you think you must be crazy. You're not crazy, they are, and you need to fight. If you won't do it for yourself, do it for folks who have no one else in their corner. They need you. Get out there. This is going to be a history lesson. This is going to be an epic in the civil rights struggle that people are going to look back on like they look at other struggles, and they're going to ask, what were you doing? And I'd love you to be able to answer. I was acting up and fighting back.
Stephanie.
Yes, first, thank you so much for having us here. This has been really an honor and a great experience. And I guess I would just echo the others in encouraging folks to get involved, to use your privilege to help with, there's so many things you could do right now. And because honestly, a small action step can make could transform somebody's life. We see this in our project, and it's hard to emphasize how much just a few calls, a few emails can do from your office in someone else's life. So I just encourage everybody to get involved, because I think that's where you'll find hope.
And I echo everything that's been said. Be present, be woke, read, think critically on your own, right? So yes, and Francine.
Thank you each and all. We're seeing all sorts of wonderful comments, people just waiting for their bar results, being inspired to fight on. So thank you. I've left my email address in the Q&A, but just to let everyone know out there, it's Francine.Lipman, and you can see my name and the spelling on the screen, at unlv.edu. I'm giving you that in case anyone wants to connect with one of the panelists. I will then reach out to them and connect the two of you. But we have come to a close, so I'm thanking again these incredible panelists for sharing their insights, their hearts, their passions, their purpose, their work, and for inspiring and motivating you to join this fight. We appreciate your engagement and thoughtful questions throughout the program. If you found today's discussion valuable, we encourage you to explore more of the programming at americanbar.org/CRSJ. This group is phenomenal, and I'm a tax lawyer. I'm a nerdy tax lawyer, but I am in loving being engaged with these litigators and these passion warriors for tax justice. And Armin is right. Undocumented immigrants pay $100 billion into the tax system with very, very few benefits, certainly not Social Security. The Human Rights Magazine is something you're going to put on your coffee table. Make sure you get a hard copy. The way you can do that is send an email to our wonderful staff at the ABA CRSJ. It's something you will look at and that'll resonate with you again and again. Stay connected with our work. You are not alone. There are lawyers from sea to shining sea and across this globe that need you to join the fight. We look forward to continuing this important dialogue with you. Thank you again, and you have an inspired weekend. Do something, anything. It can be as small as sending an email or even thumbs up like. Thank you each and all. And thank you, Allie, Paula, and ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice, and our chairs, Lacey Durham, who is phenomenal, and standing up for justice. Thank you each and all.